composers compose music that they hear inside themselves, in their imagination, and then they compare it with the realization on an instrument or on a MIDI, and then in the back and forth between the imagination conceptually and the reality of the revealed sound combinations, they make adjustments. Now, it sounds very strange because when you play a written piece and you make a wrong note, you correct because you know which one is the right note. But in composition, you don't know which is the right note. You guess it because you've heard it in your inner world. And sometimes the combinations of the sounds in the inner world of the composer are more idealized than the reality of what they produce, either by vibrations, either by instrumentarium, either by imagination. Of course, with experience, you can make up for the slight dystonia between the imagination and the realization. But in fact, most of the time, the imagination has some kind of a halo quality to it that it's almost never found in the reality of the interaction of the intimate conversation of the music notes. Would it be layered texture, or would it be chordal, or whatever it is that you express musically, or that music expresses psychologically through its alphabet language syntax, which are intervals, gestures, pulse, rhythm, combinations of harmonic crunched chords, or layered voices that combined create effervescent, evanescent, almost tails of comets sort of resonances that evaporate ephemerally as soon as appeared. And then all these imaginary structures somehow vanish in thin air. And after you heard them, you remember them. If you have trained your ear, you can notate them and take them on dictation. But it won't be the same because you reproduce something you already heard. So you repeat what you were told, just like the mother tongue, where you repeat what the diphthongs, the vowels, the sounds, the words, the language which your parents speak or sing to you in for your lullabies or so. And so the music of the words is more meaningful when you're a newborn than the concepts of the words which are used. It's the sounds of the words, of the phonemes. And sometimes compositions are imagined in the composer's thought as imaginary daydreams, just perhaps like when you start divagating in thoughts after reading or during the lecture of by yourself of fiction, and you imagine a whole film that is imaginary and personal because it's the power of projection of our daydreams and our projection of what we would like this action to be represented. And if you have a stage director who then has to make it into a theme scene for a film or for a theater play, you adapt it. But in any case, you reproduce what you already heard, either by the others, like for the mother tongue analogy, or just simply imagine your own combination of sounds, like as if each human has its own language. Of course, you cannot converse with many, if not. But in contemporary music, post-tonal, it is often the case that some composers, in order to enter in their music world, you have to learn their alphabet and their syntax and how they organize their sounds in order for you to experience how they delay them or how they superimpose them, and because the ratio, the rapport, the meaning, the emotional connection of a dissonance and a consonance don't exist anymore because they are based on the hierarchy based tonal system. So yes, you find yourself in a situation where you imagine music that others hear because they heard it somewhere else, and then you hear it within yourself. And it's not 100% new, because after all, the combination of sounds, if you take the 7 natural sounds, or for the perfect fifths, or then eventually you add semitones and you get to 12 semitones, the combinations, of course, are many, but not infinite. And chances are that willingly, because you're influenced subconsciously sometimes, or very consciously, you quote somebody else's patterns of notes. And then that could be a copyright issue, but also a communality that is shared. And of course, we use the same, in the same language that we exchange in, we use the same words and letters, but we don't always use them with the same meaning, or we don't align them the same way. Like a poet takes the words and makes music of the sounds with a meaning that is poetic, therefore beyond the meaning of the words themselves, is how combined they make you daydream of something. And so it is true that classical music or modern music or any conceptually written music, meaning not only improvised, is a music that you discover as a performer already pre-cooked, and so to say, and you put it alive by your own emotional seasoning, so to say, for the analogy with food, because it corresponds to how you understand it, or it means to you, in order to mean to others through you, even if it's the piece itself, and that you should not be over-involving, because it's such a thin margin between serving oneself and serving the piece. And that is a subjective, objective point of view according to people, to which extent your involvement is legitimate, and in which case your involvement overwhelms the text itself. If a composer's modulation by itself creates an effect, the audacity of a modulation in Schubert and Beethoven after post-tonal music is sort of faded. But if you enter in, isolate yourself willingly in the time bubble of the time, then the audacity of this modulation would have stricken you like something really striking. And beyond being striking or not, it's how you organize what it means to you, because obviously you are not the producer, you're the reproducer of the piece. But while you reproduce it, you own it in terms of not the copyright, but the spaces between the notes, the delays between the important notes, how you organize towards the climax or not, and how you, in other words, there are so many, hopefully, and that is very refreshing, different ways to revisit the same text. And that's what I find it, in fact, very humbling to study from my students when I discover their ideas about pieces I've taught, played, and recorded for decades. And I'm sure many teachers happen to that and discover that there's this way there. Oh, that's point of view of it. Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't think of it before. How come? I wasn't lazy. I love it the way it was. And then, it could also be that way. Of course, you could reject and say it's not supposed to be, because my way is the right way, and that's why I was taught, and how people play it. And then you think, okay, well, perhaps there is a way to rethink it, but it's always from the existing text. When Mademoiselle Boulanger was teaching me, she always told me, if you don't like it or understand it the way it's written, then write your own or play their own. But don't try to rearrange theirs by rewriting theirs. Interpretation doesn't implement recomposing a pattern, a decoration, an ornament, perhaps in Baroque, and not always only, but not necessarily the thematic material, the transitions. After all, these are the structural ideas the composers have displayed, or lack of, or because of. In other words, you have to enter in the conviction that you receive from the text, that you become the convinced transmitter of, and therefore the vibrant membrane of the emotional and intellectual choice of texture and context in which the message is delivered. The narrative story has an eloquent arrival point towards the audience, because the audience, either they know the piece and they disagree with the way you play it because they prefer their own way or their own preferred performers in the same text, or then they don't know the piece and they discover it as a new piece, and then they don't know what to expect because they don't have comparisons. And then you are then the performer who, like as if the author reads the book to the reader instead of the reader reading the fiction on their own. And then it happens between the eyes, reading the signs and then translating them into meanings for the storytelling, and then the imagination of how you think it develops. And therefore, it is true that the composer has heard something before the performer by essence. And if the performer hears something different in the DNA of the thought of the composer of this same piece, I think it's a richness, it's not a wrongness. Of course, you can have some composers who are very picky. Ravel started that very early in the statements, probably earlier also, but not necessarily notated, that said, on ne m'interprète pas, on me joue. One doesn't make interpretations or translations of my music. One plays my notes, period. As if there is no alternative that could be sort of not fictionalized, but I would say perhaps there is a standard interpretation expectation, then you can add your own personality in it. And so perhaps it's a customization then. Between appropriation and customization of a text in the transmission, you can betray the text. And some composers are open-minded, I am, and some other composers are less, because they prefer that their conception of the piece is what you have to have in your playing of it. In an analogy, it's like as if parents, knowing better their children's future spouses, discover them at another season of their life. They didn't know them as children necessarily, and therefore they love them for the way they see them and not the way the parents saw them since they grew up with them. And I think the composer saw the piece before the performer, but if the performer sees in the piece something that the composer didn't imagine was an aspect of it to be brought, then I think it's a richness, because it's moving. To me, it's humbling and deeply emotional when it means something so much to a performer who plays a piece of mine that means to them something, regardless of what it meant to me in nuances or in larger differences. Regardless, I think that the alterity is something I welcome, and I'm very tolerant, not with the written text when I teach it as a hyphen between the composer and the student, because then I'm here to enforce the text or the spirit of the text and the meaning of the text. And of course, you can enter the innuendos of the traditions and the instrumentarium and the way people expect the pulse, the tempo, the phrasing, and if it's related to a dance, a song, and all that. Yes, you could analyze, and you should be curious and hear other music than for piano written by the same composer, or music of the same time period by other composers, and immerse yourself in the tradition beyond that, in the civilization eventually from which this music is extracted. That means something. Is it a prayer, or is it a dance, or is it a song, or is it something more spiritual, or something more just entertaining, or both can be spiritual in their own way. The point of the story is that, yes, music is, even the same piece can mean so many things to so many people. It could mean something different to the composer. and to the parents. But then that's the beauty of it, is that performers see in your music, if they do, something meaningful to them which you didn't see. And I find that to be one of the most beautiful shared and humbling experiences, if it's meaningful to them, not just because they have to obey the roadmap of the markings on the texts. If not, of course, a good recitation is honest, and it's not dishonest to do a paraphrase and restate it. But if you think that by rephrasing it, you get closer to the composer's idea that means to you, then you take a little bit of risk with people who might, knowing the piece, be more narrow-minded and say, yes, but this edition says that, but this performer who is famous for having studied with a student of the teacher. You can find ways to justify the choices with roots and root causes, or then just say, I like it that way, which is not very doctoral answer, but sometimes is the ultimate answer, because when you play, you don't speak, you just play. And through your playing translates your experience of life, not only of the piece, but through the piece of life, and the life experience of the composer through the piece. Is it an analogy of anger or anxiety or excitement, or a combination of modulation of moods when there are no text specifically, therefore instrumental only? Yes, so you can overstate or understate the emotional impact or the intellectual construction, and privilege one more than the other, and it has to correspond to the performer's character and point of view. After all, there is a reading, as we call it, of the text when you play it. And therefore, if you read or misunderstood the text, then be it. But perhaps it's misunderstood on the point of view of whom? If people say it's too fast, it's too slow, it's too light, it's too heavy, the staccato this, the legato that, the pedal on this beat, not on the other, is not clear, or it's too blurry. Okay, all these are factual things, but beyond that, how you combine them, it's more subtle. How you express a melodic note, how you delay or not a specific note. And all the indications of the composer beyond rhythmic patterns and values of rhythmic notes and pitches are, well, pedal for the pianists, or some indications, crescendo, decrescendo, yes, but there's no percentages, so to say. How much is too much, not enough. So you relate to your intuitive, and I was going to say contemplative, that's what I was going to say first, because you look at it and goes, oh, so beautiful, so meaningful to me this way. And then, yeah, but why did he write it this way? And what do? I the repeat? And if I don't take the repeat, if I do the repeat, do I do it differently? No, the repeat is perhaps just the redundant of restatement. Perhaps it's just something about being term of endearment or insistence. And it's all about the narrative experience of the eloquence of the rhetoric. So much is embedded in so few notes that you make a choice, probably subconsciously, what you do out of what you see. And when the texture is very complex and so many things are happening at the same time, you always wonder, what should I bring out? Either none, either all. But then if it's all or none, it's almost the same. It's confusing. And if you highlight one and then you put in the shadow other elements, then you doctor it in order to perhaps be according to what you think should be the highlighting of the texture. So I think there is a subjectivity and objectivity between the filtered notation of a score from the intent of the composer and therefore their imagination of this famous inner hearing of theirs, and then the realization of what comes out when it's played. And by the time it reaches the performer, the composer has eventually tested it to, to correct if there was a discrepancy between the imagination and the realization of the real sound. Or perhaps it's just the way it is, directly from the thought to the page, and from the page to the instrument, and therefore no sketches, no second versions until I make cuts here and there to make it more fit or reorganize the shape, because then analytically the inspiration is often improvisatory, which could have redundancies or not. But when you start organizing a structure, then like writing a paper or a chapter of a book, you try to say, what am I going to convey and how will I convey it clearly? And therefore you start finding the version that you will be the most convinced by yourself before anybody reads it. So therefore you're the judge, and eventually the censor and say, no, it's not worth anything, I break it, I torn it, I burn it, whatever. No, not necessarily, but some composers do. And perhaps an objective third party would say, no, it's worthy, or you can do this with something else. You can organize it into a trio or a sonata or an opera. I mean, I'm just saying randomly things, but the fact is that music is not necessarily only what you see, it's also how it came to be. And when you analyze it, you start to understand why, or perhaps not why, how the next note is chosen according to a melodic line or a harmonic coating or a polyphonic organization. In other words, there are some rules and there are some free will of the composer, who is free to surprise us by not being logical and symmetrical per se. If the restatement in the other section of the earlier section is not textually the same, it could be accidental or purposeful. Perhaps that's also the beauty of it, to not be guessable, because I have had the opportunity to complete a sketchbook of Glenn Gould piano sonata, and when I had to record it, because I was asked to, I had to fill in a lot of gaps because he left unwritten. So I made a reconstitution according to my taste of it, but not necessarily his, because I will never know it. He had died already when I was asked to do so, and perhaps he wouldn't have liked anyway these sketches to be heard, but the record label asked me to do it. So I entered as close as I could to his DNA thought of this day, of this moment, where he threw on the paper some thoughts. And then from there, when I performed it, I found some kind of expression to record it. So it's not just the notes, it's how you shape them, how you arch them, how the phrases, sentences, it's not just syllabic or spelling bee. You go all the way to a rhetoric, perhaps monologue of recitation, but then how you organize the expression, it's according to your self-evaluation in absence of. And when there is so much indication, sometimes you don't do it because it doesn't agree with your intuition of the piece. But then you have to be respectful while you want to be creative, while you want to be sincere, while you want to be honest, while you want to be original, at least corresponding to what it means to you, not for the sake of originality. And I think that as a listener, informed or discovering the piece, you need to be open-minded, even if sometimes it's hard, but it's healthy. And I think it's humbling, and it's wonderful. Thank you.